Okay, well, it's been a long time. I'm going to try to lay out the work that's been done over the past, 3 months on the economy, Civium economy, finance, even business model, and governance. But my guess is this is going to take several videos, like four, maybe five. This one is actually going to be, I think, quite short. I just want to get across a little bit of framing, like to begin the process of the conversation. So let me propose. Imagine two different games, and I promise they're not going to be named A and B. So the nature of the first game is, in some sense, very very simple. Everybody has 100 chips, and there's some way that you play the game. And at the end of each round, everybody has some number of chips. Those who win the round have more chips. Those who lose the round have less chips. And the way the game works is that when you get below a certain number of chips, let's just say zero, when you get to 0 chips, you're out of the game. Right? So the game shrinks. Now, in this kind of a game, which is sometimes known as a win-lose game, and if you iterate, you keep playing it, what will happen is that if there is some strategy that is more effective at winning, then most importantly, just the most basic thing is everybody who doesn't choose that strategy consistently will eventually be exited out of the game. And this is like, that's it. That's the thing I want to get across, is if there's any strategy that has the characteristic of being more likely than other strategies, if there's a best strategy at getting more chips, then anyone who doesn't play with that strategy will, in some finite time, some number of iterations, end up at 0 chips, and they will be out of the game. Okay, that's the first game. The second game is a lot more familiar. Let's say you and your friends get together and you play a game of Monopoly. Okay. Now let's imagine though that for some reason everybody's playing the game of Monopoly for the reasons that people play games, right? You're playing it to have fun. There's a sense of camaraderie. There's sort of jokes being told. There's a felt sense of warmth, and of course, there's the competitive nature of focusing on the details of the game. Except for one guy. This one guy, for whatever reason, is choosing to just ruthlessly focus on winning Monopoly. Like he wants to get all the Monopoly money, and he is doing everything. Like he is lying, he's threatening people, he's going back on his word. He's like arguing the law, the rules of the game. Like he's doing everything in his power to get the most Monopoly money. Okay. Now, you might imagine that if you play Monopoly a few times, let's say you play it 5 or 6 times, he may actually win the game more often than other people. In fact, if you play it so that it's cumulative, i.e. each time you play, you actually keep the stack you had in the previous game, he's going to end up being the winner, right? There's this notion that Monopoly is the kind of game where if you really try hard to do nothing but win the game, and everybody doesn't just sort of like quit the game or defect against you, you might win, right? In fact, you more likely will win. All right, so let's. Now, here's the thing. This is the key of that second game. There's something else that happens in this second game. And that's called, fuck you, dude, you're an asshole, you're no longer one of our friends. Right? If somebody behaves in that fashion, no matter how many piles of Monopoly money they have, they lose something very important. And that is membership in the community, the society of friends. And no matter how much Monopoly money you've got, you're not going to be able to exchange that for friendship. Right? You can't use Monopoly money to buy membership in the friendship group. So you've made actually a very bad trade. You've traded winning Monopoly money for being in the friend group, right? For being a member of the Society of Friends. Okay, now our global financial system, and increasingly over the past long period of time, 500 years, our economy, and increasingly our society has begun to look more and more and more like game one. Right? So what ends up happening is that, for example, imagine if you could use Monopoly money to buy things that were kind of like being in the friend group. Like, for example, you could use Monopoly money to buy food, or you could use Monopoly money to buy houses. You could use Monopoly money to buy cars. And in fact, let's make it even more challenging. If you don't have Monopoly money, you can't buy those things. Where the capacity of the friend group to be able to do things like provide food to each other is limited by their access to monopoly money. So now game 2 starts to look a whole lot like game 1. And sort of that's the thing. Now, and what do I mean by this? Why am I putting these models out there? Well, let's say we were looking at a proposition to shift how investors invest in innovative technologies. Let's just make that's the new story. So I'm going out to people, anybody, right? Anybody who's got resources, anybody who's got money, or any resources actually that can be converted into money. And I say, look, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to change the way that you're investing in innovative technologies. And investors basically break up into two groups. Let's just make it real simple. Group 1 says, okay, what's this new model? And the model is, let's make a new set of values. Right? We're going to make investments. So we're going to make those investments on the basis of the innovative technologies that are in fact provide the most good to the world, right? The ones that have the most holistic value. And we're gonna try to look at that in a not strictly monetary sense. We're actually going to take a look at it and say, are we thinking about all the gaps that have a hard time being monetized? Daniel's how much is a whale worth notion. Right? Not everything can be monetized. In fact, many of the most best things can't be monetized. So we're going to look at those things. Right? That's this first team. We're going to look at those things. And we're also going to look at the monetization. But we're going to have both of these in our value scheme. Team 2 says, fuck that. We're just going to look at how much money it makes. Right? What's the maximum money on money return that we can get? Now, if you compete with these two against each other, and the only metric that you're actually able to grasp is who has more piles of money at the end of some iterations of turns, who has the highest ROI on return on investment, and everybody who doesn't compete effectively on the ROI metric gets extinguished from the game, i.e. nobody gives them money to deploy, you start getting something like the first game I mentioned. Right? And this, of course, is the evolution of the investment environment. Right? Things like, and this, by the way, historically, you can actually trace this coming out of World War II. The concept that the business of, or the mission, the responsibility of business managers is to quote unquote maximize shareholder value, for example, as a principle, emerged out of a place where that wasn't obvious and universal and became increasingly requisite. And I don't necessarily mean obvious and universal, I mean requisite, because if you weren't doing that, then shareholders or investors wouldn't give you their money because they're not going to maximize their shareholder return. And since the nature of the game increasingly became one where more and more and more, you couldn't do meaningful things without money, and you could buy something like a simulacrum of friend, a simulacrum of community, a simulacrum of life and of well-being with money, you end up like that really weird denatured Monopoly game where the friend group's like, fuck you, you're out of the friend group, we don't want to play with you anymore. But the guy with the big pile of Monopoly money is like, okay, I'm going to buy a private island and I can buy something kind of like a friend group who are going to be really interested in hanging out with me because they want to be close to the pile of money, right? Now that's broad, painting with a broad brush, right? There's a lot of gaps. I am not implying that, say, for example, Elon Musk is an utterly irredeemable asshole at all. Like I don't know him at all personally, and I have a strong sense he's actually kind of a cool guy. But the point is, the polar archetype that wins games of this sort looks more and more and more like that, right? That's kind of the attractor in the system. Now, if you want to get out of that, you can't try to just promote people to be losers. You can't say, hey, everybody, why don't we all change the way that we're, say, for example, investing and focus on really thinking about what is the whole system consequence of what we're doing and have sort of an ordinary level of expectation of return. Because if you do that in the current domain, in the current mode, they're just going to be losers. They'll lose the iteration because their return will be lower than everybody else's return, or the return of people who don't play that way. And eventually they will have to be exited from the game. Like eventually they will actually just be out of resources, and nobody wants to be out of resources in this current environment. So how do you change that? The way you have to change it is you have to return back to the not denatured model of monopoly, which is where exiting from the society of friends is a real cost. Like it's actually a big deal. And where monopoly money is really monopoly money, that less and less and less value is associated. You can buy less and less and less of the things that you actually care about, your meaningful aspects of life, with this currency. So to return to our metaphors, the thing you have to do, the key move, is you have to deeply, deeply, deeply restore the value of friendship, the value of being in a real community that is composed of these whole relationships. And you have to return money to monopoly. And you have to devalue or remove the degree to which one believes that one can, and in fact the degree to which, of course, one actually can trade monopoly money for a simulacrum of real relationship. Once you've done this, and if you can truly protect the interiority of this friend group, or you've created something that has a sort of a boundary around it, and where being inside of it gives you access to well-being. It gives you an access to a wholesome life, a life where your aspirations and values are both supported and well met by other people. Not a simulacrum, but the real thing. And there's a boundary around it whereby that can't be extracted by people who are playing a win-lose game on the outside, people who are optimizing for some subset of that whole, optimizing for some narrow metric, specifically, for example, money. If you can establish that, if you can establish that kind of dynamic, then you can actually do the thing that we're trying to do. So the next video or two probably will talk about a proposal for how that might look in the context of Civium. Like, what's the Civium business model, and then what's the Civium's relationship with the exterior, and what's its interior? Right? How does it operate on its inside to provision holistic well-being and the capacity to maintain a boundary, and how does that boundary interrelate with the rest of the world? I guess I lose my promise with what I've called Game A. And then probably the third video after that, we'll talk about governance. And maybe two more. So we may be talking about 5 videos all in. And then we'll be ready to move on.